Hey, good morning, everybody. Welcome into Morning in the Word. Glad that you've joined us today. It's the 23rd day of September, and we're in Matthew chapter 18 today. Matthew 18 is a chapter with several familiar stories. There are just some teachings of Jesus that we always remember, and you'll recognize some very memorable ones here. And you know, one of the things that we stress in Morning in the Word is the more familiar something is, the harder we have to look at it to find application, because familiarity leads us to assume that we already know what's to be taken from that story. And so we stress trying to work a little harder in the more familiar stories. So this morning, a few thoughts that I might share with you as we get into this discussion. First of all, the conversation that Jesus has at the beginning of this story is one that I think we can all relate to. Who's the greatest? I think a lot of times we assume that they're talking about who among us is the greatest, and it could be that that was exactly what was intended. We know that the apostles had a lot of trouble with arguing about among themselves who was the greatest. Two of the brothers wanted to sit on either side of Jesus' throne, to the point that they even got their mother to try to make an appeal for him. We know that at least on one occasion, late in Jesus' ministry, they were fighting with one another along the way, arguing about which one was more important to the kingdom. And it could be that, but it also here could be that this is just guys being guys. Guys can't talk very long without getting into an argument about the greatest. Bring up basketball, and how long does it take before LeBron versus Jordan starts to be a conversation? So it could be that they're talking about Old Testament figures. Could be that they're talking about famous patriarchs and such. But what's important is it doesn't matter. You see, God's not interested in our greatness. We got to remember, God's not impressed by our greatness. When we do something by our standards really, really well, to God, that is still not impressive. And so he's not interested in greatness. He's not impressed by our greatness. He's impressed and pleased by our humility. And I think that's a really important lesson for us to learn. We often are striving to do something great for God. And I'm not saying that we shouldn't work hard, but striving for greatness is really a silly proposition, when instead God is impressed and pleased when we humbly accept instruction like a little child. Good for us to remember that. We have the story of the 99 sheep that were left, and the one that was found. And this is another great story that has a lot of application. And you know, one of the things that we always say is that we try not to assume the best. When we read the parable of the soils, we assume that we're the good soil. But in doing so, we miss a great impact of the lesson. Here, when we talk about the sheep that is lost that Jesus, the good shepherd, goes to find, we always assume that we're with the 99 lounging around in the pen. But the reality is, the story is more impactful if we see ourselves potentially as the one that he has to go and find. And that's where we have some real application. The last line of this particular story is one that's also significant, and probably one that we gloss over. And that is that he doesn't want any to be lost. He doesn't want any to be lost. In our world today, we have, for some secular thinkers, a picture of God as a vengeful, vindictive, and angry God who is watching every stumble and fall of humankind for the sadistic pleasure of condemning them. But that's a far cry from what we see of God in the Bible. And we would be wise, at least in our own minds, to always be actively restoring the true picture of a merciful God who wants none to be lost. Chapter 18 includes a preacher's favorite passage too. Not maybe favorite passage, but one that's near and dear to us. And that is the teachings about how to correct a brother. Because one of the great problems that all churches have, because churches are made up of people, and people have problems, but all churches have problems with gossip. How many times when my preacher friends and I get together, the conversation quickly goes to, I wish that people would talk to me instead of talking about me. And how many problems we could solve quickly that way. how much better off we would be as a church family if we would talk to one another instead of talking about one another. And a good reminder as we read this passage today to never let ourselves fall into the trap of talking about someone unless we have first talked to them. That would end gossip in a stroke. And speaking of brother with a fault against you, the final story leads into beautifully forgiveness and forgiveness. It's probably because of this very thing that the question was even asked, how many times should I forgive? He just got done saying that if somebody has a problem, you have a problem with somebody, go to them for the purpose of reconciliation and solving the problem. And so that prompted probably the question, well, how many times do I do this process? A generous offer of 7. But Jesus blows that number out of the water. The point that I think is important here is for us to remember that it is in keeping with our ability, our willingness, our desire to forgive that God considers his forgiveness to us. The Lord's Prayer says, forgive us our debts as we forgive our debtors. As we forgive our debtors. That word as is one of the most frightening words because it is in keeping with, to the same extent of, in the same manner that, do we forgive in a begrudging and hateful way, as if somehow it were being pulled from our hands? Or do we forgive in a gracious and loving and kind, open-handed kind of way? Because certainly that's the way that we want to be forgiven. So it'd be good for us to reflect a little bit on that very idea this morning and give some thought to familiar stories that maybe don't receive practical application in our lives as they should. Hope you have a wonderful day. We'll talk to you soon.